Hey everyone, very quickly before we get into the video, the YouTube channel recently reached 10,000 subscribers, and to celebrate that, I'm going to be doing a Q&A next week. Now, in order to gather all of the questions, I set up a channel in my Discord channel specifically for this. If you've ever wanted to ask me a question, can be about anything, then head over to the link in the description towards my Discord channel, and then you can go and ask your question there. Now, back to the video. Hey everyone, this is Mike, and today we're going to be talking about big pulls or wall-to-wall pulls in dungeons, as they've kind of become the standard over the last few years when it comes down to running your expert roulette or even going through your leveling dungeons. Now, if you end up liking this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and if you're new around here, hit that subscribe button. Now, when it comes down to doing big pulls, it's something that a lot of people like to do because it is very efficient. Not only is it time efficient because you go through the dungeon a lot quicker, but you're also making a much more efficient use of all of your resources as well, like for example tank cooldowns, DPS cooldowns, and healing cooldowns as well. And that is why a lot of people like doing big pulls or wall-to-wall pulls, because not all dungeons follow the same procedure of 2 mob packs a wall, 2 more mob packs a mini boss. Like for example the last 2 new dungeons that came out in Shadowbringers have a little bit of a different formula when it comes down to doing those big pulls. Sometimes you might have more mob packs, sometimes you have less, sometimes it looks a little bit weird, like for example in the newest dungeon there are some weird interactions there as well. But basically a wall-to-wall pull still means grabbing everything that you can until you hit a point where you can't go any further and you need to kill the mobs first before a new gate will open, or for example some bushes disappear or whatever it might be. Now of course, if you want to be doing big pulls, there are a few requirements for it, and that is why some people, especially when they are leveling up going through the main story, might have some negative interactions with doing big pulls and are not as confident to doing them when it comes down to end game dungeons. And that is for 2 main reasons. When it comes down to doing them in lower level dungeons, not everybody has access to all of the AoE skills that they might want to be using. Tanks have less cooldowns, DPS have less DPS cooldowns, healers have less healing tools, and because of that, in low level dungeons, big pulls might be a little bit more sketchy to do and might also not always be very useful for you to do, because not everybody has the AoE tools available that they will at later levels into the game. Another thing that is very important to note is gear requirement. When you're going into a leveling dungeon, it could be that somebody has been doing Palace of the Dead, for example, to level up, for which you don't need gear, and then they decide to do a level roulette, and all of a sudden they are thrown into the level 45 dungeon, and they're still wearing level 15 gear. Well then, of course, you won't really be able to do big pulls with those people because their healing output will be lower. If they're a tank, they're just gonna get shredded by the mobs. If they're a DPS, their DPS output won't be high enough for the mobs to die fast enough. So in those kind of scenarios, you might want to kind of hold off on doing big pulls. What I personally like to do myself is when I go into a dungeon for the first time with a new group, I do a big pull at the start of the dungeon to see what I'm dealing with, so to speak. So I do a big pull. If I see that the party is struggling with keeping me alive, with killing the mobs in time, then I'll slow down for the rest of the dungeon. Of course, the other way around as well, if I see that the rest of the party handles it just fine, then I can just keep doing the big pulls for the rest of the dungeon. So what is everybody's role when it comes down to doing big pulls then? Because of course every single role has their own responsibility to make it a very smooth experience and definitely make it not the bad experience that some players might have with it. So first of all, let's start off with the tank and then go to the other 2 roles as well. When it comes down to playing the tank, very important, make sure your tank stance is on. I just did a dungeon earlier today, the tank forgot their tank stance, I ended up eating a tank buster, not so much fun. So make sure your tank stance is on, then go and grab all of the mobs that you can grab until you hit a wall, and then try to group them together as much as possible as well. A lot of jobs in this game don't require a target to do their AoE damage, so they can just go stand in the middle of the mob pack and they'll be fine, but there are also plenty of jobs that do require a target or that have like a conal AoE rotation. So make sure you just bunch up the mobs as much as possible so that everybody can hit everything and just make it a much smoother experience, because of course if they can hit everything, they're doing more damage. More damage means that the mobs are going to die quicker. Of course, once you've gathered everything, you do want to be using a defensive cooldown, and tanks nowadays have access to so many different defensive cooldowns that this really shouldn't be an issue. For example, Rampart, you're 30%, some tanks have a unique cooldown, like for example Camouflage or Thrill of Battle. Then you also have your spammable cooldown, like the Blackest Night. Sheltron, whatever else you might have. If you're a warrior, Nascent Flash is much better to be used on AoE packs because you can actually heal a lot, because you're hitting like 6-7 mobs with your AoE damage, meaning you're going to be healing a lot from that. And then of course, two cooldowns that a lot of people usually forget about are Reprisal and Arm's Length. Reprisal is now an AoE skill and it's also on a very low cooldown, so you'll be able to use it for pretty much every big pull that you're going to be doing. Arm's Length is basically a 15-second duration rampart. Doesn't necessarily reduce the damage that you take, but it does make it so that the mobs are going to be attacking 20% slower, and of course 20% attack speed slow means that you take 20% reduced damage, as most of the outgoing damage from mob packs is going to come from their auto attacks. Last but not least, you can also use your invulns, of course. If you're not a paladin, these might not be as straightforward and usually require a white mage to not be too painful to heal up. If you're a paladin, just use your hallowed ground whenever you can because it's very strong. If you're playing any of the other three tanks, then of course a little bit of communication might be warranted, where you're like, I'm going to use my invuln on the next pack, keep some healing cooldowns ready, or something like that. Then moving on to the DPS players. When it comes down to playing DPS, it's pretty simple, just do damage. That's really all there is to it. But of course, one thing that is very important to note is that some DPS players also have access to damage reduction tools, more importantly the ranged physical DPS, whenever they use their Tactician, Troubadour, and I forget the name of the dancer one, Shield Samba. Those all reduce the damage taken by, I think it's like 10% or something. So definitely use those during mob packs as well, as they will be useful. Same thing goes for healers. For example, Neutral Sect, the Seraph, or the Wings of White Mage, forgot the name of that as well, Temperance. They all reduce the damage taken by party members as well, so it will also work on mob packs, of course. Damage mitigation is not only the tank's job. Outside of just using defensive stuff, also make sure to use offensive abilities. Stuff like, for example, Inner Release, No Mercy, Battle Litany, Battle Voice, all of those raid buffs are going to be very useful on mob packs as well, because in AoE damage is where you're going to be doing the most damage in the dungeon, so your raid buffs are going to be benefiting your team a whole lot more during those trash packs rather than on a single target scenario when you are fighting that mini-boss. And last but not least, we've come to the healers. Pretty simple here as well, just do as much damage as possible, and then when you can't do as much damage anymore, just focus on keeping your tank alive. Now, the reason why I say do as much damage as possible and then later on start healing more is because at the beginning of the trash pool, the tank will have their cooldowns rolling. For example, your DPS will also be using their raid buffs and stuff like that, and during that window you can be doing a whole lot more damage. Then by the time your tank runs out of cooldowns, that is where you will need to start healing a whole lot more. If you're playing a white mage, Holy will also stun the mobs for about 5 to 7 seconds, so during those 5 to 7 seconds your tank is just taking 0 damage. So basically you doing damage as a white mage is preventing damage taken by the tank as well. When it comes down to the other two healers, they don't have stuns, but on the other hand they do have abilities to weave in between their AoEs, so they can basically keep their tank alive with some off-global cooldowns here or there whilst their defensive cooldowns are up, and then by the time the defensive cooldowns of the tanks run out, or of the tank runs out, that is where you might need to be spamming some GCD heals in order to keep them alive. But usually by the time that your tank runs out of cooldowns, because the tank is AoEing, because both of your DPSs are AoEing, because you have been helping with the damage as well as a healer, by that time usually the mobs are almost dead and you don't really have to worry too much about keeping your tank alive. And those are pretty much all of the things that you really need to do when it comes down to doing big pulls in a dungeon. Your tank gathers everything, pops some defensive cooldowns, of course, very important, don't use everything at once, but try to stagger them a little bit so that you have at least something to cover for yourself at any given time in the trash pack. Then when it comes down to your DPSs, just do damage, use your raid buffs as well, because more often than not they are going to be much more used on an AoE scenario rather than on a single target fight. Of course, things like Chain Stratagem or Trick Attack are usually better used on a boss, but still everything else will be good in AoE scenarios. And when it comes down to your healers, give your tank a little bit of a shield, maybe a regen or something like that, and then just do as much damage as you can, and then by the time that your tank runs out of their cooldowns, hopefully the mobs are almost dead. If they are not, that is when you'll have to give them a little bit more attention to try and keep them alive through some extra healing that you might have to do. So those are kind of my tips for doing big pulls. If you have any more tips yourself that you like to use, that you would like to share with the rest of us, then feel free to leave them in the comments down below, and I'll make sure to give them an upvote so that other people can see them as well. But that's gonna be it for me. I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.